Okay, so this particular screencast video lecture is going to be exclusively devoted to Marx's theory of class conflict as a driving force of history, which is one of the questions that I've asked you to answer in the Marxism vocabulary exercise. And you'll see that I had um, strategically selected certain images from the internet that I saw that are reflective of history as class struggle from the 19th century, from the 20th century, from the 21st century. Okay, you see the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King here in the middle, the great Chicano movement leader Dolores Huerta, organizing workers and encouraging them to band together in solidarity to fight for um, uh, a living wage, the right to be treated with dignity and just not as a commodity, which is to say simple labor power, to be treated as a human being for that matter. And you see this young gentleman up here in the far right, part of the Occupy Wall Street movement, saying, "Dear 1%, we fell asleep for a while. Just woke up, sincerely, the 99%." So all of these images are examples of history in the making and history as a product of what Marx referred to as class conflict. And Marx, in all of his works, including the Communist Manifesto, which I'm about to read portions of from y'all, uh, he marvels at the productive capacities of capitalism. It's productive of so many different things. It's productive of commodities. It's productive of immense amounts of surplus value, which is say profit, and it's also productive of class conflict, which can produce history in the Marxist sense. I'll talk a little bit more about what Marx means by history in the progressive sort of sense, in the sense that it produces rights, it produces more humane working conditions, and it has the potential to be able to uh, produce legislation passed by the state that requires companies to fairly compensate their workers for their labors. So I first want to read something out to you on the productive capacities of capitalism from uh, the Communist Manifesto on page 40 of this particular edition, with an introduction by the great historian Eric Hobsbawm. So on the bottom of page 40, he says, the bourgeoisie, and this is the 19th century he's talking about here, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment or an inkling that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? Ends with a question mark right there, right? So he's basically saying is that social labor, right, which is to say the labor power of the proletariat, the working class, has produced under capitalism the modern world as we've come to know it. And it would have happened without the labor or the labor power of the working class or the proletariat, right? And he also says on through the next couple of pages, on page 42, he says that capitalism also produces class conflict, right? And what he refers to as class consciousness. And I'm going to read this out to you. And this is about on page 42 in my version of the Communist Manifesto. It goes through to page 43, ends on page 44. He says, in proportion as the bourgeoisie, that is, capital, is developed, in the same proportion is the proletariat, the modern working class, developed. And so capitalism produces these two great classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Uh, and so it's a class of laborers who live only so long as they find work. He's talking about the proletariat here, and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital, which is to say profits, surplus value. These laborers who must sell themselves piecemeal, must rent out their labor to the bourgeoisie, are a commodity. They're looked upon as a commodity by capital or the bourgeoisie, like every other article of commerce, and are consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes of competition, to all the fluctuations of the market. Now, owing to the extensive use of machinery and the division of labor, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character and consequently all charm for the workman. He becomes an appendage of the machine. It is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack or skill that is required of him. Hence, the cost of production of a workman is restricted almost entirely to the means of subsistence that he requires for his maintenance and for the propagation of his race or his class, so to speak. But the price of a commodity, and therefore also of labor, is equal to its cost of production. In proportion, therefore, as the repulsiveness of the work increases, the wage decreases, right? Remember from Marx, you look at the history of capitalist societies, right? The cost of subsistence, right? What it requires to produce labor power, right? Is what it is that a laborer or a member of the working class is paid, right? So, nay more, in proportion as the use of machinery and division of labor increases, in the same proportion, the burden of toil also increases, whether by prolongation of the working hours, by increase of the work exacted or demanded in a given period of time, or by increased speed of the machinery, etc. Modern industry has converted the little workshop of the patriarchal master into the great factory of the industrial capitalist. Masses of laborers crowded into the factory are organized like soldiers. As privates of the industrial army, they are placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. Not only are they slaves of the bourgeois class and of the bourgeois state, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the overseer, and above all, by the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself. The more openly this despotism proclaims gain to be its end and aim, the more petty, the more hateful, and the more embittering it is. So, capitalism is extremely productive. It produces immense amounts of surplus value or profit on the backs of the laboring classes or the working classes. It produces immense amounts of commodities and in very, very diverse amounts. And in as much as it produces immense profits uh, and empowers the bourgeoisie at the same time that it disenfranchises and disempowers and immiserates the working class. It also produces class conflict, which is a motor, if you will, of history.